Adolf Eichmann was the architect of the Holocaust's logistics, the man who organized the trains that carried millions to the death camps. After the war, he vanished. He lived under a fake name in Argentina for over a decade, working a factory job, blending into the suburbs of Buenos Aires. He might have died a free man. But one of his own sons, Horst, started dating a Jewish girl, and her growing suspicions about the family helped lead Mossad straight to his door. Here's the thing though, Horst didn't betray his father on purpose. In fact, after Eichmann was captured, Horst flew a swastika flag over the family home, because 3 of Eichmann's 4 sons didn't just defend their father. They built a neo-Nazi terror cell in Argentina and started attacking Jews. And the 4th son? He said his father deserved to die. But what most people don't know is what happened to the family Eichmann left behind. Because the story of his 4 sons is far stranger and more disturbing than anything you'd expect. The Clement family lie. In 1950, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Argentina under the alias Ricardo Klement. He carried forged papers provided by a network of sympathizers that stretched from Europe to South America. A rat line that had already smuggled dozens of former SS officers to new lives. He settled in Buenos Aires, found work at a Mercedes-Benz plant, and kept his head down. To his neighbours, he was just another European immigrant trying to start over in a new country. 2 years later, his wife Vera and their sons joined him. Vera knew exactly who her husband was and what he had done. She had been a committed Nazi Party member since before the war, and her loyalty never wavered. She packed up the family, crossed the Atlantic, and resumed life beside a man the entire world was hunting. The couple had 4 boys: Klaus, Horst, Dieter, and Ricardo. They grew up in a modest suburban house in a working-class neighbourhood, attending local schools, learning Spanish, living what looked from the outside like an ordinary immigrant childhood. But inside that house, nothing was ordinary. Eichmann never once expressed regret for what he had done. He spoke openly to his sons about the war, about the Reich, about the ideology that had driven it. He framed himself not as a war criminal, but as a soldier who had followed orders in service of a cause he still believed in. The boys absorbed this worldview the way children absorb anything their parents teach them, completely and without question. For nearly a decade, the Clement family lie held. The neighbours didn't suspect. The Argentine authorities either didn't know or didn't care, and Eichmann grew comfortable enough to let his guard slip. That comfort would cost him everything. The night the mask was ripped off. On May 11th, 1960, a team of Mossad agents grabbed Adolf Eichmann as he stepped off a bus in the San Fernando district of Buenos Aires. They bundled him into a car, drove him to a safe house, and held him for 9 days before smuggling him out of the country on an El Al flight disguised as a sedated crew member. It was one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the 20th century, and it shattered the Clement family overnight. Vera and the boys went from anonymous suburban nobodies to the most notorious family in Argentina. Journalists camped outside the house. Neighbours stared. The world now knew their real name and everything attached to it. Most families in that position would have retreated. They would have locked the doors, drawn the curtains, and tried to disappear into the chaos. But that isn't what happened. Instead of running or hiding, Horst, the second son, the one whose girlfriend's suspicions had helped lead Mossad to the family, responded by flying a swastika flag over the house. He began wearing a Nazi armband inside the home, openly and defiantly. Klaus, the eldest, echoed his brother's stance. This wasn't grief, it wasn't shock. It was a declaration. A family planting its flag in the rubble of its own exposure. The older sons didn't crumble under the weight of their father's crimes being dragged into daylight. They radicalized. But while the sons were doubling down in Buenos Aires, their mother was planning something that would remain secret for decades. Vera's secret mission to Israel. While the world debated Adolf Eichmann's fate, while legal scholars argued over jurisdiction and diplomats exchanged protests, Vera Eichmann wasn't sitting idle. She petitioned Israeli authorities for permission to visit her husband in prison. It was an extraordinary request. This was the wife of the man who had organized the deportation and murder of 6 million Jews, asking the Jewish state for a favor. And in a decision that defied every expectation, they granted it. On April 30th, 1962, Vera traveled under her maiden name, Vera Lobel, boarding a Swiss Air flight from Zurich. When she landed in Israel, security officers met her on the tarmac and hustled her through side gates at Ramleh prison to avoid reporters. Not a single journalist knew she was in the country. She sat across from her husband through a thick glass partition, speaking through earphones for roughly 80 minutes. They talked about the family, about the boys, about practical matters. It was the last time she would ever see him. Golda Meir herself had approved the visit, but with strict conditions. She comes, she sees him, she leaves the country immediately. No press conferences, no public statements, no second visit. Israel calculated that a quiet humanitarian gesture would blunt international criticism in the weeks before the execution. It was a calculated move. Compassion with a political purpose. The visit remained classified for decades. When details finally surfaced, historians noted something telling. Vera showed no sign of moral reckoning during those 80 minutes. She hadn't come to confront her husband about what he had done. She had come to say goodbye to the man she still loved, the cause she still believed in. And when she returned to Buenos Aires and told her sons what had happened, it didn't bring the family closure. It hardened the older boys for what came next, the rope and the fracture. On the night between May 31st and June 1st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged at Ramleh prison. It was, and remains, the only time Israel has ever carried out a death sentence. His body was cremated, and the ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea beyond Israel's territorial waters, so that no country would hold his remains and no grave could become a shrine. The 3 older sons had known it was coming. Eichmann's trial had been broadcast around the world. The verdict was no surprise, and the appeals had been exhausted. But knowing something will happen and accepting it are 2 very different things. For Klaus, Horst and Dieter, the execution didn't close a chapter. It opened a wound that would never heal. They saw their father not as a convicted war criminal, but as a martyr, a man persecuted by the enemies of the cause he had served. The execution didn't end the Eichmann story. It split the family into 2 completely different narratives, and the direction those narratives took is something no one would have predicted. The sons who built a terror cell. Klaus, Horst and Dieter didn't distance themselves from their father's legacy after the hanging. They weaponized it. In the months and years that followed, reports from Israeli and British investigators described the 3 brothers establishing a small neo-Nazi cell in Buenos Aires. They weren't writing angry letters or attending quiet meetings in back rooms. They were harassing and physically attacking local Jews, targeting members of the very community their father had tried to erase from the earth. They used the Eichmann surname not as a burden but as a badge of honor. In far-right Argentine circles, the name carried weight. It opened doors to networks of former SS officers, Nazi sympathizers, and the broader underground of unrepentant fascists who had found refuge in South America after the war. The brothers moved through these circles with a sense of entitlement, as though their father's crimes had earned them status rather than shame. Carmen Breton Lindemann, who knew the family during this period, later described Horst as a strong Nazi who considered himself closer to his father's ideology than even his older brother Klaus. Horst wasn't just sympathetic to National Socialism, he was devoted to it with a fervour that unsettled even some of the old guard. He saw himself as carrying on his father's work, not in the bureaucratic sense of trains and deportation schedules, but in the raw, street-level sense of intimidation, and violence. Dieter followed a similar path, quieter but no less committed. Klaus, the eldest, served as the group's informal leader, the one who connected the family to broader networks and gave their activities a sense of purpose beyond random aggression. Together, the three brothers represented something deeply disturbing, proof that the ideology hadn't died with the regime. It had been passed down, absorbed, and put back into action by the next generation. This wasn't passive sympathy inherited through dinner table conversations. This was active, violent continuation. But while three sons were building a terror cell in Buenos Aires, the fourth was on a completely different trajectory, one that would eventually produce the most shocking statement any Eichmann ever made: the son who said his father deserved to die. Ricardo Eichmann, the youngest of the four brothers, took the opposite path. At some point after the execution, he moved with Vera back to Germany. While his brothers were attacking Jews in Argentine streets, Ricardo was pursuing an academic career. He enrolled in university, studied archaeology, and eventually joined the German Archaeological Institute, where he specialized in the ancient civilizations of the Middle East. He published research. He earned the respect of his colleagues. He built a life defined not by his father's name, but by his own work. But the real shock wasn't his career change. It was what he said publicly. In interviews during the 1990s, Ricardo stated plainly that his father's execution was justified, that Adolf Eichmann deserved to die for the enormity of his crimes. He didn't hedge. He didn't frame it in legal abstractions or offer qualified sympathy. He looked at the full weight of what his father had done: the trains, the camps, the millions of lives reduced to logistical problems. And he called the hanging justice. Think about what that means for a moment. One household, one father, one ideology pumped into four sons from birth. The same bedtime stories about the glory of the Reich. The same casual hatred spoken over breakfast. The same worldview absorbed through years of daily exposure. Three of those sons became neo-Nazis who attacked Jews in the streets. The fourth said the hanging was deserved. Something broke the pattern in Ricardo, and historians still aren't entirely sure what it was. So what happened to all of them in the long run? The answer is almost stranger than the split itself. The quiet ends, and the one who never left. Klaus, the eldest, eventually moved back to southern Germany. He fathered 5 children, settled into a quiet life far from the Argentine underworld he had once inhabited, and died in 2015 at the age of 79 after years of suffering from Alzheimer's disease. By the end, he reportedly couldn't remember his own name, let alone his father's. It was a silent, anonymous end for a man who had once led attacks on Jews in Buenos Aires. Whether the disease erased the ideology along with the memories, no one can say. Horst stayed in Argentina. He worked manual jobs, furniture removal, odd labour, the kind of work that keeps a man anonymous in a sprawling city. He never married into prominence, never built anything lasting, never rose above the margins. He died of bowel cancer in Buenos Aires in December 2015, just months after his brother Klaus passed away in Germany. 2 brothers, separated by an ocean, dying within the same year, one fading into forgetting, the other fading into obscurity. Ricardo continued his academic career in Germany, maintaining his public stance against his father's legacy. He gave occasional interviews, always measured, always clear-eyed about what Adolf Eichmann had been and what he had done. He represented something rare among the children of Nazi leaders, not just silence or distance, but active moral repudiation. And then there's Dieter. Dieter split his time between Germany and Argentina for decades, never fully committing to either country, never fully letting go of either world. But here's the detail that stops you cold. As of 2018, a British investigation found Dieter still living in Buenos Aires, just a few miles from the exact bus stop in San Fernando, where Mossad had grabbed his father nearly 60 years earlier. Still a retired construction foreman, still supportive of his father's Nazi ideology, still there, as though nothing had happened. as though the capture and trial and execution and decades of historical reckoning had simply washed over him without leaving a mark. The family didn't scatter. The ideology didn't fade. It just went quiet. What creates the break? The Eichmann family has become a case study for historians and psychologists trying to understand how extremist ideology either persists or gets rejected across generations. The question isn't complicated to state. It's almost impossible to answer. 3 sons raised in the same house by the same father with the same indoctrination stayed loyal to an ideology responsible for the murder of millions. One didn't. What was different about Ricardo? Some researchers point to age. Ricardo was the youngest. He had the least time under his father's direct influence before the capture shattered the family. Others suggest that returning to Germany, where the Holocaust was publicly confronted and taught in schools, exposed him to a counter-narrative his brothers in Argentina never encountered. Buenos Aires in the 1960s and 1970s was full of former Nazis living comfortably, their beliefs unchallenged. Germany, for all its struggles with memory, was at least trying to reckon with the truth. Historians still debate how much the sons actually knew about their father's specific crimes versus the broader nationalist mythology he fed them. Did Eichmann describe himself to his boys as a logistics coordinator for mass murder, or as a patriot who served his country in wartime? The distinction matters because it shapes how deeply the indoctrination penetrated and how much moral reckoning each son would eventually need to do. The open questions remain unanswered. Did any of the older brothers ever privately express remorse? A quiet doubt shared with a wife or a friend that never made it into the historical record? How much did Argentine authorities know and tolerate about both Eichmann's presence in the country and his son's later violence? And what does it mean that a nation that sheltered war criminals also incubated a second generation of true believers? What the Eichmann family proves is that the Nazi legacy in South America wasn't just a collection of old men hiding in suburban houses waiting to die. It was an active incubator, a place where ideology was maintained, transmitted, and put back into practice by sons who had never set foot in wartime Europe. But it also produced Ricardo. And that's what makes this story impossible to reduce to a simple lesson: the legacy that recruited. The story of the Eichmann sons is usually a footnote to the capture and the trial, but it shouldn't be, because it answers the question most people are afraid to ask about Nazi families. Did the children turn out like their father? The answer is worse than a simple yes or no. 3 of them did, and they proved it with violence. 1 didn't, and he proved it by saying his father deserved to die. The same house, the same dinner table, the same last name. Completely different choices. Legacy doesn't just haunt, it recruits. It reaches into the next generation and asks a question that every child of a monster eventually has to face. Do you carry this forward, or do you put it down? 3 Eichmann sons picked it up. 1 set it down. And as of just a few years ago, at least one of them was still living within walking distance of the place where it all fell apart. The bus stop in San Fernando, where the mask was ripped off and the Clement family lie died forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, check out our other deep dives into the families who lived in the shadow of the Third Reich. And, as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'll see you in the next one.